Hey everyone, beneath the smell of fresh pizza on Prince Street was something far darker, a basement that just didn't store flour and cheese, but bricks of dope. And from the 1950s to the 1980s, one Lucchese crew built an empire that ran from Little Italy to the Mediterranean. They laundered duffel bags of cash to their neighborhood through banks and moved dope by the kilo through Ray's Pizza and even helped trigger the paranoia that made Joe Valachi flip and expose the Mafia in 1963. This was the Prince Street crew, led by Joseph Joe Beck DiPalermo and his brothers Charlie and Petey Beck. And they weren't shy about narcotics, they actually embraced it. And by the mid 1950s, Joe Beck was already called the Dean of Dope Dealers. And when federal agents swept up 60 members of his ring in 1957, the fallout put not just Joe Beck in the dock, but Vito Genovese himself. And that trial and the paranoia it sparked shook the Mafia to its core. I'm James Proctor, and on this episode of Real Mob Stories, we're pulling apart the rise, the rackets, the violence, and the legacy of the Prince Street crew. From Joe Beck's origin story to Ray's Pizza, and from the French Connection to its final days. This is a true story, and without further delay, on to our feature presentation. The Prince Street crew was born out of Manhattan's Little Italy, a neighborhood where Sicilian immigrants carved out both community and rackets. And at the center of this was Joseph Joe Beck DiPalermo, who was born on June 8, 1907, to parents from a town near Corleone, Sicily. He grew up on Elizabeth Street and was already on police blotters as a teenager, with his first arrest in 1925. By 1930, census takers listed him as a painter, but by then, DiPalermo was already moving in the underworld. Joe Beck came up under the Gagliano faction, and this was the Lucchese family before Tommy Lucchese took control. And like many early Lucchese members, he was Sicilian through and through, with three of his brothers, Charles and Peter, among them joining the life. Charlie would later marry into the Cuomo family, linking the crew to Ralph Cuomo, who was the man behind Ray's Pizza. And Petey Beck, meanwhile, would eventually become captain of the crew by the 1980s, replacing Joe Beck. But Joe Beck wasn't just another neighborhood hood. In January of 1943, his name surfaced in one of the most politically charged mob hits in American history. It was the assassination of an anti-fascist newspaper editor named Carlo Tresca, and it happened on Fifth Avenue. Investigators suspected that Carmine Galante was the trigger man, while Joe Beck and possibly his brothers Peter were accomplices. The getaway car was traced to a man living just doors away from DiPalermo's Elizabeth Street home. And while no man was ever convicted of it, the Tresca murder tied Joe Beck's crew to major mafia affairs and forged a lasting bond between Joe Beck and Galante, who were two men who would later dominate the narcotics trade. By the late 1940s, Joe Beck had earned a reputation as both an enforcer and a rising narcotics trafficker. And despite his unassuming look, because this guy was short, balding, wore horn-rimmed glasses, newspapers still called him a most vicious criminal. He dabbled into bootlegging and forgery, but increasingly his specialty was heroin. And by the 1950s, his growing prominence made him the de facto captain of the Lucchese's Manhattan crew, running his own operation centered around Prince and Elizabeth Street. The DiPalermo brothers were building a drug syndicate that would reshape mafia history, and it all began here on Prince Street. By the mid-1950s, Joe Beck DiPalermo had earned a title whispered across New York's underworld, the Dean of Dope Dealers. From his base in Little Italy, he had built a narcotics ring of nearly 60 men and women, moving heroin sourced from Corsica and Mediterranean labs straight into Manhattan. In July of 1957, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics and FBI agents struck. He had 60 arrests in one sweep. You had couriers, middlemen, street dealers. But two names stood out among those arrests. You had Joe Beck DiPalermo and Vito Genovese, the boss of the Genovese family. Their joint trial in 1959 became one of the most famous drug cases in mob history. Both men end up getting convicted and get sentenced to 15 years in prison. Vito Genovese, as we know, dies in prison. Joe Beck lives to see another day. But the trial's true impact came from the testimony of a courier in Joe Beck's ring, Nelson Nelly Cantellops. He was a Puerto Rican dope runner who became rat. He became a federal witness. His words not only brought down Vito Genovese, they unleashed a wave of paranoia. You see, behind bars in Atlanta, Genovese demanded vengeance against potential informants. And that climate pushed one soldier, a soldier known as Joseph Valachi, over the edge. In 1962, Valachi killed a fellow inmate he thought was sent to silence him. Racked with guilt, Valachi flipped and in 1963 became the first mob insider to publicly expose Cosa Nostra at the Senate hearings. In a twist of fate, Joe Beck's dope business indirectly cracked open the Mafia's code of silence. While Joe Beck sat in prison, his brothers and allies kept the pipeline running. In 1959, a young hood fresh out of prison, Ralph Cuomo opened Ray's Pizza at 27 Prince Street. To the public, it was just another neighborhood slice joint, but to the DiPalermos, it was the perfect front. Cuomo became their distributor and partner, literally part of the family after Joe Beck's brother Charlie married Cuomo's sister Marion. Ray's basement, with its whitewashed walls and dirt floor, became a packaging depot. Heroin shipments smuggled from Sicily and France were cut, bagged, and moved out by the kilo, while upstairs customers ordered slices. Downstairs, you had duffel bags of cash piling up, and the crew had even laundered the proceeds to the East River Savings Bank, where they had an insider on payroll. Al DiArco, who later became the acting boss of the Lucchese family, recalled that one of Joe Beck's sons hauled bags of bills to the bank almost daily. And this wasn't pocket change, because by the 1980s, the federal government estimated their take at $2 billion. But not all that cash went back into the family. Wise guys from Prince Street were known for being notorious, degenerate gamblers. Cuomo himself blew fortunes at the racetrack in Atlantic City. Al DiArco once said he'd be at the racetrack all the time, fueling a cycle where heroin profits fed gambling losses, which in turn drove the need for more dope. The Prince Street's network tapped into the broader French Connection pipeline. Lucchese traffickers like Angelo Tominero worked with Bonanno powerhouses like Carmine Galante, moving kilos through East Harlem and Brooklyn. And even after the French Connection was supposedly broken, Prince Street kept the heroin flowing, often through Sicilian middlemen. By the 1980s, the Sicilian Zips were running their pizza connection across the United States. But decades before them, the DiPalermos and Ralph Cuomo had already pioneered the model, a pizza shop doubling as a heroin hub. They were never indicted in the Pizza Connection case, which suggests either blind luck or a separate supply chain. But make no mistake, Ray's Pizza wasn't just famous for its slices. In mob lore, it's as notorious as John Gotti's Ravenite Social Club, except this joint was about dope, not sit-downs. In its prime, the Prince Street crew embodied the Mafia's great contradiction, a ban on narcotics that was little more than a myth. Joe Beck and his brothers showed that with the right front, the right connections, the right neighborhood cover, you could run one of the most powerful heroin pipelines in America right under the city's nose. By the 1970s, the Prince Street crew wasn't just about heroin anymore. They'd expanded into quaaludes and cocaine, chasing new markets. In 1977 and 1978, DEA agents uncovered a clandestine lab on Ellis Street in Staten Island. It was tied directly to Joe Beck's crew. In August of 1978, Joe Beck and 3 co-defendants were convicted of conspiring to manufacture and distribute quaaludes. So at nearly 70 years old, Joe Beck proved he was still in the game. So prison didn't change him at all. The biggest blow came in April of 1986. New York State announced one of the largest narcotic busts in its history. 38 indictments, including Joe Beck, his brother Charlie, and their associates. Investigators estimated the ring's sales at $2 billion, feeding nearly 100,000 addicts every day. Also arrested was Gus Sperling, who's the son of Harlem heroin legend Herbie Sperling. So that showed the Prince Street's pipeline reached deep into a multifamily network. By the late 1980s, age and indictments had caught up with Joe Beck. His health had declined, and control of the crew passed on to his younger brother, Peter, who was known as Petey Beck. According to future acting boss Al DiArco, Petey became a made man and a captain, overseeing what was left of the Prince Street operation. But the crew's glory days were fading, and even inside the Lucchese family, resentment was growing. DiArco once confronted Petey face-to-face for letting dope flood Little Italy's own streets, which was a dangerous breach of mob protocol. On January 10th, 1992, Joe Beck DiPalermo dies at the age of 85 after 6 decades in the narcotics trade. Joe Beck had spent nearly half his life behind bars. Yeah, he never flipped, he never broke with the Mafia's code, and he never stopped hustling. As one account summed it up, get the drugs, sell the drugs, make the money. That was Joe Beck's creed to his final days. One of the most fascinating side stories of the Prince Street crew is Joseph Bonanti. He was born around 1933, and Bonanti grew up in Lower Manhattan and was first arrested alongside Ralph Cuomo in the 1956 botched Prince Street holdup. That tied him to the DiPalermo circle early, but he never earned his button with the Lucchese's. You see, Lucchese leaders saw this guy Bonanti as reckless, undisciplined, and a brokester. He was too prone to drinking and smoking pot to be trusted. But by the late 1970s, Bonanti had drifted from Little Italy to Bath Beach and Bensonhurst in Brooklyn, and he hooks up with Anthony Old Man Spero. He was a Bonanno captain who would later become the acting boss of the family. Spero saw some use in Bonanti's stick-up skills and underworld connections, and by the late 1980s, early 1990s, Bonanti was officially working under Spero and mentoring the young Bath Avenue crew. He had featured names like Paulie G, Jimmy Calandra, Joey Calco, and Tommy Reynolds. The kids actually thought that Bonanti was washed up, but he did teach that crew about armed robberies, burglaries, and how to navigate mob politics. Even if Bonanti was washed up and a lazy pot smoker, he was a formally inducted member of the Bonanno family, and you had to listen to him. And more importantly, Bonanti was close to the one person that mattered in Bath Beach, Anthony Old Man Spero. Spero was an old-timer that became the concierge and later underboss of the family. I think even the acting boss. Spero himself was a huge moneymaker and is known for making millions off of illegal fireworks. Even so, Bonanti had a shaky reputation. Bonanno elders saw him as a bad influence, egging the Bath Avenue kids to deal crack without restraint. Bonanti's journey shows how fluid loyalties could be in Cosa Nostra. You see, he started out as a Lucchese associate, part of the Prince Street orbit, but ended his career as a Bonanno in Bath Beach. Bonanti's story underscores that for mob associates, loyalty was often to individuals, to a DiPalermo or to a Spero, rather than to the family name. So the Prince Street crew was unlike most Mafia crews. This wasn't just a collection of associate and wise guys working for a capo. This was a family within a family, bound by blood. Joe Beck DiPalermo led with his brothers Charlie and Petey at his side, and even their brother-in-law, Raffie Cuomo. It became indispensable through Ray's Pizza. Few crews in mob history was so heavily tied to one surname and one bloodline. If the Gotti brothers defined a Gambino era, the DiPalermos embodied the Lucchese's Little Italy crew. Above all, they were remembered as the dope crew. While Cosa Nostra officially condemned narcotics, the DiPalermos specialized in it. For decades, Lucchese bosses looked the other way because the heroin profits were just too rich. From Corsican and Sicilian connections to domestic labs, the Prince Street boys were knee-deep in it, long before the Pizza Connection trial made heroin pizzerias infamous. In fact, they pioneered the tactic. Ray's Pizza at 27 Prince Street doubled as a heroin depot as early as the 1960s. But their success came at a heavy price. Unlike other crews who kept drugs away from their own neighborhoods. The Prince Street crew sold right outside their doorsteps. In the 1980s, H was peddled just blocks from St. Patrick's old cathedral school. Even the nuns noticed. One famously marched out and scolded the gangsters for poisoning children, including their own grandchildren. Al DiArco, later the acting boss of the Lucchese's, nearly started a war over this, threatening Petey Beck himself if sales to local kids continued. By the 1990s, the crew was just a shadow of its former self. Joe Beck died in 1992, Petey Beck aged out, and Ralph Cuomo kept Ray's Pizza running until he pled guilty in 1998 to heroin charges and went to the pen. When Ralph Cuomo died in 2008 at the age of 75, Ray's finally closed, erasing the last physical trace of the crew. The remnants of Prince Street were absorbed into other Lucchese factions, and as of today, FBI reports that the crew's capo is unknown. In the end, the Prince Street's legacy is twofold. They were the most infamous Mafia dope crew in New York history, and they were proof that the Mafia's so-called ban on narcotics was a myth. Their story is one of family bonds and poison profits, of power won and neighborhoods destroyed. And even today, when you hear the name Ray's Pizza, some remember the slices, but mob historians remember the heroin. The story of the Prince Street crew is a story of contradiction inside the Mafia, a crew that specialized in what was supposedly forbidden, narcotics, a crew so tightly bound by blood that DiPalermo's, Charlie, Petey, Joe Beck, and even their brother-in-law, Ralph Cuomo, that became a family within a family. They pioneered the idea of the pizzeria as a heroin depot decades before the Pizza Connection trial. They laundered millions through neighborhood banks while peddling dope just steps away from schools and churches. And for nearly 4 decades, Lucchese bosses just looked the other way because the profits were too great to resist. In the end, Ray's Pizza wasn't just known for slices. It became infamous as a symbol of the mob's poison profits. If this story gave you a deeper look at how the mob worked in Little Italy, do me a favor, hit that like button. It helps others discover these stories, and don't forget to subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss the next deep dive that we put together here on Real Mob Stories. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, and let's have a great discussion. And if you want the full documents, timelines, and sources we used to put this episode together, just head over to realmobstories.com. You'll find extended research and more interesting cases that we're working on, like the Joe Piney Armone FBI files that were released just this past week. I'm James Proctor. Thanks for watching. Until next time, take care, stay safe, and God bless you always.